He thought she loved him, but then they won the lottery. These twisted tales of betrayal prove that money can ruin anything, even true love. Although I believe some of these relationships were over before money came their way, but you tell me. Lynn Ann Poirier and Howard Browning seemed like the perfect couple. They were both 53 years old and living together in Lynn's home for years. One day, they were talking about winning the lottery, and they decided to make a promise. If either of them ever won the lottery, they'd split the winnings 50-50. That's a pretty big promise. The Florida couple were serious lottery players who bought tickets as often as they could. Before they had access to the Powerball, they even took road trips up north to try their luck in big number lotteries in Georgia and South Carolina. On June 2, 2007, they stopped at a convenience store. While they were there, they both bought tickets for the Florida Lottery's Firecracker Millionaire raffle. They took their tickets home and placed them on the fireplace mantle in their living room like they always did. The drawing finally arrived on July 4th, but Lynn didn't come home that day. Howard was obviously confused and very worried about her. He made calls and tried to find her until he had a thought. Maybe he should check the lottery tickets. He looked through them and quickly realized that one of Lynn's tickets was missing. Howard checked the drawing and was shocked by what he saw. Lynn had run away with the winning ticket. She'd hit the $1 million jackpot, which left her with $750,000 after taxes. Howard couldn't believe it, but the love of his life had taken off with all his money. She didn't come home for a month. Finally, she showed up on the doorstep. Howard welcomed her back in, but he asked if he could have his share of the money. Of course, Lynn said no. 6 months later, Howard realized she didn't love him enough to stick to their deal, so he sued Lynn for breach of oral contract. This wasn't an easy case. There were two sides to the story and almost no proof for either side. Lynn claimed that they'd never agreed to split any winnings, and she'd purchased the ticket herself. She even said she'd broken up with Howard months before she bought the tickets. She said she'd been living with her mother. When she was confronted with the CCTV footage from the store, which was captured when she bought the tickets, she needed to explain why Howard was clearly there with her. She said they'd shown up at the same time by complete coincidence. Howard's side of the story was very different. He said that not only was Lynn lying, but he was the one who had bought the tickets. He even had an ATM receipt to prove it. He said that the purchase happened after they stopped at the store that night on their way home from having dinner together at Red Lobster. Suddenly, after they'd both given their side of the story, Lynn pulled out her ace card. She said even if Howard was telling the truth, it didn't matter because of Florida's statute of frauds. That law states that if any agreement can't be performed within a year, it must be reduced to writing to make it enforceable. Therefore, Lynn said, because she won 14 years after Howard said they made the deal, the contract was null and void because they'd never written it down. Suddenly, the court case changed. Now they were trying to work out if Lynn still had to honor her verbal agreement or not. In the end, the court decided to let Lynn off the hook, but the story wasn't over. After hearing the verdict, Howard appealed to the Supreme Court of Florida. This time, he won. Why? Well, the Supreme Court decided that, even though the agreement wasn't executed within the year, in this case, it didn't need to be. The only reason it wasn't executed was because they didn't win that year, but they could have won. That was what made the difference. The agreement could have been enforced within that year, so it didn't need to be written down to be enforceable by law. Lynn was ordered to pay Howard $291,000, but sadly, it still didn't go Howard's way. 1 month later, Lynn filed for bankruptcy, saying she had spent all the money. Howard is contesting that claim, but he might never get the money Lynn stole from him. Lynn made sure to use the law to her advantage and stop Howard from ever seeing that money. But she's not the only one who's done this. Kirk Stevens and Laura Hoyle met in 2018. It wasn't long before Laura moved into his $300,000 three-bed house in Nottingham, England. Kirk never asked her for rent, and instead the couple decided she would buy $30 worth of lottery tickets every week. They agreed that if she won, they'd live the good life together. One week in March 2022, Laura checked her ticket and thought she'd won just $6. But she was wrong. She'd actually won the National Lottery's Set for Life jackpot. She'd receive $12,500 a month for the next 30 years. Laura quit her job and splashed out on a Porsche Cayenne. Then the couple made headlines as they became professional ghost hunters. Kirk said they were semi-sharing the money, with Laura paying him $1,250 a month. She even encouraged him to study for a master's degree, promising to pay it off. But in June this year, after attending a friend's wedding in Bristol, Laura decided to dump Kirk. He was shocked. He wanted to try and fix it all, but Laura didn't. He didn't realize she was serious, so at first, he didn't mention the money. But eventually he realized she was not coming back. So he asked about his share that she'd promised him. He said she made it very clear she wasn't going to be splitting the money with him. She told him the cash she was giving him was rent, and that she wouldn't pay it now that she'd left. The £500,000 home they had put a deposit on became her place instead of theirs, and she moved in all on her own. But that was just the start. Laura arrived to take a whole lot of their stuff out of Kirk's house, and she even said she wanted the dogs as well. Despite the fact that the ticket was bought in Laura's name and with her card, Kirk believes they were joint winners. But the law doesn't agree. Because they were not legally married when the ticket was bought in Laura's name, he has no claim to any of the jackpot money. Kirk is right to feel betrayed, but sadly, the law doesn't care about his feelings. By now, you're probably thinking that only women do this to their partners. We're here to tell you that's definitely not true. In fact, we can prove it. Thai couple Wijak Wanaprasit and his wife Porntida Chandawet couldn't believe what they saw when they checked their lottery ticket one day. They'd won 6 million Thai baht. In case you're wondering, that's over $198,500. All young couples wish they'd win the lottery and be able to spend it all together. And they went to bed dreaming about all the things they could do with their new fortune. But the next day, they started arguing about the money. Finally, Wijak decided to walk out and take the winning ticket with him. Porntida panicked. She didn't want her angry husband spending all the money without her. But instead of trying to talk him down like most wives would do, she simply filed a police complaint. Wait, what? That's a pretty serious thing to do. If he's found guilty of misappropriating the winnings, he'd get a prison sentence of several years. It wasn't long before the media heard whispers of the weird story and started publishing articles about it. Wijak must have gotten worried about the prison sentence because he decided to come back to his wife. He was pretty quick to tell everyone that he never intended to cash out the prize on his own. And this might be the most amazing part of the story. The couple is still together now. I guess anything is forgivable when a lottery jackpot is involved. But then again, it depends who won the jackpot. You'll be glad to hear that this next story is going to end exactly the way it should have. This anonymous winner was having one of the worst years of her life. It all started when she found out that her husband had been cheating on her. She thought it couldn't get any worse until she learned that the person he'd been cheating with was her best friend. Her husband walked out on her and started living with her friend instead. But her nightmare was far from over. He left her with a hefty mortgage. She was a seamstress earning a modest wage, so it was a struggle to make ends meet. But she wasn't the only person her husband had walked out on. They also had a daughter together. She was suddenly a single mom, and she couldn't afford her daughter's school tuition. She was desperate to look after her daughter, so she emptied her savings trying to make the mortgage payments. But it wasn't long before she couldn't keep it up. She was just days away from losing her home. The house was already scheduled for auction, but she couldn't take the thought of seeing her daughter sleeping on the street. So she walked into a store and bought 2 lottery tickets for the Superheroes Double Chance Millionaire Lottery. But the odds were seriously stacked against her, even more than normal. Unlike other lotteries, you can only hit the jackpot in the Superheroes if you win 2 consecutive draws. It's just as impossible as it sounds, but somehow that didn't stop this down on her luck mom. Somehow, she won both the El Sinuano and the Carapeña Noche draws. And to make her story just a little more mind-blowing, she hit the jackpot on the 1-year anniversary of the day her husband walked out. But how much had she won? Would it help her? Well, she took home the equivalent of $331,000. That's not as big as the jackpots in the US, but it is big in Colombia. In fact, it's the largest jackpot ever won in the game. The average monthly salary in Colombia is only $950, so her jackpot could be considered a fortune. She was shocked, but she couldn't be happier. This meant she could keep her house, and she even had enough money to pay for her daughter to study at her dream college. But before they could finish celebrating, she got a call from the husband, who had left her and his own daughter for her best friend. He was the first person to call her after news of her huge win broke, and he sounded pretty flirty on the phone. You'll be glad to hear she didn't fall for it. We don't know about you, but we're pretty glad she won after her husband left when he had no right to any of that cash. That story is a rare case where the person who deserved the money got to keep it all. The next story didn't end so perfectly. Abraham Lee Shakespeare was a hard-working day laborer who never finished school and was a little down on his luck. But he'd always dreamed of living in a big mansion in North Lakeland. He had no idea that he might one day get the chance to live that dream. Back in November 2016, he won an incredible $30 million jackpot. He chose the lump sum payout of $17 million. He was delighted that he'd be able to buy his mansion, but he was also super generous with his wealth. The community basically won the lottery too that day. Abraham was happily paying for rent, groceries, funerals, and other important things for the people he knew, and even some he didn't. But eventually, the constant request for money took a toll. Abraham started to distance himself from people, except for one. In November 2009, 42-year-old Abraham vanished. His cousin was the first person to report him missing. He claimed that he hadn't been able to contact Abraham in months, and he wasn't the only one. Abraham's friend, Greg Massey, said they'd spoken in April when the new multi-millionaire had asked for advice about managing his money. That was over half a year ago by now. Detectives had a difficult task. They didn't know if Abraham had simply left or if he was dead. But they did know one thing. There were a lot of people out there who owed him money. So they started by checking out anyone who might be trying to get out of their debt by making Abraham disappear. But nobody jumped out at them. So they switched tactics and began checking Abraham's phone records. Up until April 9th, 2009, they mainly found calls from people looking for money. But after that, there was only one number that kept coming up. It belonged to Doris D.D. Moore. When detectives showed up to question her, she claimed she was giving him financial advice. She also had another interesting piece of information. Abraham was totally fine. She said she had contact with him and she'd tell him to give them a call. Investigators waited days for a response that never came. While they were waiting, Dee Dee did something pretty weird. She asked the media for an interview. In the end, it was a 3-hour-long chat. Mainly, she insisted that Abraham was not dead. She also explained she'd met him in 2008 when she offered to write a book about his amazing story. That was when she offered him financial advice. But Dee said Abraham had already spent a whopping $11 million. Mostly, he'd given it away or loaned it to the people in the community. So she took control and started contacting his debtors. Other people backed up this story. They said that before he went missing, Abraham went around introducing Dee to the people who owed him money. Most people agreed their relationship was a little more than just a financial advisor and her client. But investigators weren't convinced. They called Dee in again, and she showed them a video dated April 9th. It showed Abraham telling her he wanted to leave Lakeland. But that wasn't enough for investigators. They got a warrant to check Moore's phone data, and it revealed something very interesting. Dee and Abraham were in the same room during every call between them after April 9th. Let's face it, there's only one reason you'd call someone who's in the same room as you. You're trying to pretend that you're talking to them. Investigators asked Dee if she had Abraham's phone, and at first she said no. But when they pushed, she admitted she had the phone, but she'd recently thrown it out of her car window. She said it was because Abraham didn't want to be found. They now knew she was a liar, so they tricked her into thinking they needed her help. They told Dee that Abraham's mother was desperate for a call from her son on Christmas. Sure enough, she got a call on Christmas Day. Amazing, right? Only Abraham's mother told police that her son didn't sound like himself. He'd also told her that he wasn't feeling very well. Investigators linked the call to Greg Smith. They tracked Smith's phone to a crowded shopping mall parking lot where they saw him and Dee doing something shady. It looked like they were exchanging money. Authorities interrogated Smith, and he told them that Dee paid him to call Abraham's mother. He'd met her because she'd come to collect money that he owed to Abraham. Smith agreed to become a confidential informant for the police. They came up with a plan. Smith would tell Dee that he had a cousin who was going to prison for 30 years on a drug charge, and that he'd take the rap for her if she'd done something to Abraham. An undercover officer posed as the fictional cousin, telling Dee that he needed $50,000 for the favor. He then cleverly convinced her that she had to tell him exactly what happened to Abraham so that his story would stand up if the body was ever found. She agreed, and police knew for the first time that Abraham was dead. The next day, Dee met the undercover officer again. She handed him a gun and a map. It led to the location of Abraham's body. Dee was arrested. She agreed that Abraham was dead, but said she wasn't the person who did it. It didn't convince interrogators. After all, Abraham's body was found wearing the same clothes as the ones in the video Dee had shown investigators when they first started asking questions. She was charged in 2010, but pleaded not guilty. The judge didn't believe her. He called her cold and cruel and sentenced her to life in prison. Abraham's story didn't end well, but at least there was justice. This last story might also have ended with true justice. Back in 2004, happy couple Desmond and Maureen Todd made headlines after winning the lottery in the UK. Together, they were 3 million British pounds richer. That's over $3.7 million. The couple came to the agreement that they were the joint owners of the ticket. They even agreed on what they wanted to do with the money. Only, their life wouldn't stay the same for long. Desmond decided to run away from Maureen only 15 months after their big win. It won't surprise you to hear Desmond claimed most of the millions for himself. Then he went on an international gambling spree. Maureen didn't hesitate to tell that story to the court when she decided to take her partner to justice. The case ended in 2007 when the couple finally chose to settle. At the time, Maureen was 55 and Desmond was 53. According to Maureen, Desmond took most of the money for himself. all Maureen got was $50,000. But the court case may have helped. We don't know for sure what they settled on, but you'll be happy to hear that Maureen likely got what was rightly hers from the start. Think these are the worst lottery crimes ever? Well, some crimes start before the win even happens. These are the 10 most mind-blowing times people tried to claim fake lottery tickets. You don't want to miss this video.